As a parent now, I think a lot of like, I'm the oldest of four girls, and all of us are really, I think, reflections of our home. And I'm always like, why didn't we rebel? Like, what did Iman Abba do right? How could we continue on that, in that way? Like, it's really interesting for me to think about. I think when I was little, like because I saw how much fulfillment and meaning they had in their role, like part of me wished that I could be a rabbi, a congregational rabbi.
This is Women's Gallery, the podcast where we showcase women defining Jewish leadership today. My name's Joanne Greenaway, and each episode I interview one incredible female leader making a mark in her own way on the Jewish community. We explore different models of leadership in the context of schools, shuls, universities, batei din, and more. And this week we are turning our attention to Israel, and I'm delighted to welcome Rabbanit Shayna Goldberg. Welcome to Women's Gallery, Shayna.
Thank you. So great to be here.
Shayna is someone I haven't met, but I've always admired and followed very much. Just to give you a bit of background, Rabbanit Shayna Goldberg teaches Israeli and American post-high school students, particularly at the Stella K. Abraham Bet Midrash for Women in Migdal Oz. And she serves as mashgicha ruchanit there, which is something I really want to explore today. She's also a yoetzet halacha, a contributing editor for Deracheha, womenandmitzvot.org, and a co-host of the podcast called Women Talking Mitzvot, which we spoke about with Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, who was a guest on this podcast a month or so ago. And Shayna is also the author of a very important book called What Do You Really Want? Trust and Fear in Decision-Making at Life's Crossroads and in Everyday Living. She lives in Alon Shvut, Israel, with her husband and 5 children, and she comes from New Jersey, which I'm sure you'll recognize in her accent, where she worked as yoetzet halacha for several shuls, and she also taught at the Exceptional Girls School, Mayanot Yeshiva High School. So, Rabbanit Shayna, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. I'm really excited to learn more, and I wanted to start by turning to this position of mashgicha ruchanit that you have done alongside other roles for the last 15 years. And I really think it's a fascinating leadership role. And we try to explore on this podcast different models of Jewish leadership for women today in the Orthodox world. And it's something I discussed something similar with Rabbanit Yafit Clymer, who works in a high school for girls while she's a Rabbanit Bet Sefer. But I think there's something very unique and special and different about working in the Bet Midrash, in the Midrashah kind of context, with women who are at this like really critical turning point in their lives almost. So I wanted to ask you to start by explaining what the role involves and why you chose particularly to work in that kind of setting with young women, what kind of leadership that requires for you, how do you come to that personally?
I'll explain a little bit what the role of mashgicha ruchani is, because I'm sure not all the listeners are even aware, because it's not something that exists in all places. But the role of mashgicha ruchanit is something that actually comes out of the world of yeshivot, where in addition to ramim, which are like the rebbeim who teach the actual shiurim and oversee the intellectual learning and growth of their students, there's often also a role of a mashgiach, who is there to look out for the spiritual well-being and the growth of the students, which is a little bit different, than the academic growth or how they're doing in terms of their learning or their skill building. And in every institution, the role looks a little bit different and works a little bit differently based on what the institution's needs are. So in the Beit Midrash of Migdal Oz, where I work, which is the sister school of Yeshivat Har Tzion, which a lot of people are familiar with, like the Gush. So the role is less formal, meaning my main job, in addition to the classes that I teach and other responsibilities that I have, is basically to sit in my makom, which is my seat in the Beit Midrash, with an open chair next to me and be available for any student that wanders over to discuss whatever it is on her mind. Or sometimes they'll ask in advance, they'll WhatsApp, can we meet at this time or can we talk over lunch? And my role is to be available. And it's interesting because when I was originally hired, this was not part of my job description. I was hired to teach and I was hired for some administrative responsibilities, but over time, it kind of developed organically, I would say in large part because of the topics that I teach. Meaning one of the big classes that I teach in Migdal Oz is called Bein Ish V'Isha, meaning the halachot that are connected to the dynamics and relationships of men and women. And it's a class that focuses, let's just say, on all the areas of halacha that are the most sensitive and the most complex and often the most challenging, especially for young women in particular. So we'll, give
Probably
her
the most on their minds, to be quite
exactly, like topics like modesty and dress, nude and kol isha, and covering hair, and shmirat negiah, and nida, and things like that, which are very personal topics that often young women struggle with because they really affect and connect very much to our identity and how we see ourselves. And therefore, after class, many of them would often wander over to discuss something that was, triggered for them by the class that they want to explore more, or they were upset by, or touches on something from their background. And because I ended up having a lot of one-on-one conversations, I found myself in this role that eventually the Beit Midrash more formalized. They made it into something more official, as an official part of my job. That now we tell the students, that this is my role and they could come over. And in
Mhm.
terms of what I bring to the role, which is interesting to think about, I think I would connect it back to the fact that I was very privileged to grow up. Even though I made Aliyah from New Jersey, from Teaneck Bergenfield, I actually grew up in New York, in Great Neck, which is on the North Shore of Long Island. A lot of people know about the South Shore, the Five Towns, but this is the North Shore of Long
Mhm.
Island. And my father, Rabbi Yaakov Lerner, was the rabbi of the Young Yeshiva of Great Neck for 45 years. And he, alongside my mother, Mrs. Abby Lerner, who was a very active Rebbitin and also a teacher in Yeshiva University's high school for girls, Central, they struck this amazing balance between integrity and sensitivity in everything that they did. Meaning that on the one hand, they had incredible integrity to the halacha and to Avodat Hashem, and they were very real with people and honest about the halacha is asking from us. And at the same time, they were still able to be incredibly sensitive to the people that they worked with in terms of where they are and what are their real life issues. And I think in my work, I tried very, very hard to emulate that, to have that integrity to the halacha, but to really see the students or whoever it is that I'm talking to that's in front of me. And as you said before, it's this age that I'm working with. I taught in high school for many years, but I find that this age of post high school, I'm teaching 18, 19, 20 year olds, is a very crucial stage of life because it's very formative, but it's also a very vulnerable stage of life. It's
Mhm.
often the first time that young women have left their homes, in a real way, that they're figuring out their identity. Who am I as an independent individual? Who am I as a Jew? What do I want my connection to
Mhm.
be? And on the one hand, they're full of potential and they're full of passion and they're full of idealism. And on the other hand, you really need to be very sensitive to the fact that they're coming from somewhere, and you don't want their growth to be disconnected from their homes or from everything that they have really learned and accomplished in their lives until that point. And I think
Mhm.
that's not a
Incredible.
simple balance.
No, I think it takes a huge amount of sensitivity, and I think it's a fascinating role because, on the one hand, it's a pastoral role, and people are familiar with those kind of roles that exist in schools, even secular schools across the world. But there's this spiritual dimension that is where you have a huge influence and a huge responsibility, actually, in terms of people's spiritual growth. And I want to come back to really what that involves in depth, but I'm really struck by these role models that you had in your parents, because it really sounds like it was a very natural path to you for you to follow the path that they'd set.
Yeah.
But when you deal with young people, I guess you see a lot of people who are rebelling, and most people dafka want to do the opposite to what their parents do. So was it always obvious, or have you come back to it? Was
So I
there a
really
time that you moved away and came back?
as a parent now, I think a lot of, like, I'm the oldest of four girls, and all of us are really, I think, reflections of our home. And I'm always like, why didn't we rebel? Like, what did Iman do right? How could we continue on that, in that way? Like, it's really interesting for me to think about. I think when I was little, like, because I saw how much fulfillment and meaning they had in their role, like, part of me wished that I could be a rabbi, a congregational rabbi, because there's something that was very, very special about growing up in a house like that, even with all the complexities. I would say from the time I was pretty young, I think even earlier than high school, maybe like 13, 14 years old, I really knew that I wanted to teach. And I already at that age, like I would sometimes like give, little shir in the shul to the younger kids. I was a group leader on Shabbat morning for like younger girls in fifth and sixth grade. So I think in my head, when I picture what I would do in my life, I thought that I was gonna teach because I love learning Torah and I'm gonna prepare classes and I'm gonna give it over and I'm gonna try to make it engaging and exciting. I don't think that I imagined then that I would be spending the bulk of my time engaged in one-on-one conversations, like more than the teaching. And it's not surprising, as you're saying now, because I think that that's what I saw in my home, or my parents probably even more time than my father put into the sermons, the drashot that he gave on Shabbat, or that they put into the classes that they gave, which by the way, they put in a ton of time because they never just winged anything. They always gave things the time and the respect that they deserved. But even more time than that, they invested in just like thinking about the relationships with the members of their community. And so that
Mhm.
was something that from an early age, like even with my friends, I tried to be a good listener or to help them talk through something that was weighing on them that they wanted to
Yeah.
process. So it's not surprising, and yet it's not exactly what I planned for. And actually share that I have a lot of friends, thank God, who are in the world of teaching. And many times I get into conversations with different friends or colleagues of mine about what brought them there and what they like more, what they like less. And sometimes they'll share with me that like they love, preparing a new sugya if they're teaching Gemara, or they love learning through a parak in Tanakh if they're teaching Chumash or something like that. And that they understand that yes, like obviously like speaking to students about their lives are also part of like what it means to be in this role, but it's not necessarily the thing that
Mhm.
they most enjoy. And recently I was having a conversation like that with someone, and like I just realized how for me it's so the opposite. Like how for me, the relationships that I have are really what are at the center for me. And then the teaching is enjoyable around that, meaning I love teaching in the context of relationships. I love that Torah is the vehicle through which we could connect or through which we could talk about ideas, but so much so that I realized that when I'm invited to give a shiur in a random community where I don't necessarily know people, or to speak in a school of students that are not mine, it's not that it's not fulfilling. It's still, meaningful, but it's nowhere as significant to me as an
Mm.
experience as the time that I could give to current students or to alumni that thank God I'm very much in touch with, or to the kalot and the couples that I teach before their weddings and afterwards. And it's actually helped me, this realization has helped
Mm.
me like fine tune how I want to spend my time. Like I stopped saying yes to a lot of more kind of random things, not because I don't think that those things are important, but just because in terms of how you divide up your time, I
Yeah.
realized what for me is more meaningful.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I also like to explore this aspect of how we make our choices within our careers and working out what, where we want to be and where we want to focus. It's huge. And I totally hear that from you, that your like overriding strength is being in those relationships. And I'm sure you have a huge influence and impact on these young people's lives, which is also a big responsibility. So I'm thinking about their religious growth. And I don't know how you personally define religious growth, if that's taking on more mitzvot or something else. But I wonder how within that relationship and within the context of the midrashah,
Hmm.
what do you try to achieve? Like particularly when, as you said, you've got these women who are away from home, away from their lives. Like how do you balance helping them to grow on their journey, wherever that takes them, and at the same time not overly influencing them to do something that might clash in some way with where they've come from when they go back? It's a big
It,
question, right, in the
it
midrasha
is such
world,
a
but
huge
particularly for
question.
your role.
Yeah, it is such a huge question, and I'm so happy that you're raising it. And it's a sign also of like the sensitivity that you have as an educator, because I don't think that it's something that is on everyone's minds. And actually, last Pesach time with Scott Kahn, who is the host of the Orthodox Conundrum podcast, my husband and I did a podcast with him specifically on the topic of healthy education and really keeping these
Mm-hmm.
kinds of issues in mind. So I'll share with you two really overarching things that are in my mind when I talk to young women or young men for that matter, and not only young women and men, I guess anyone, about religious growth and about commitment towards halacha, so that I feel good about the balance, that we're maintaining here. One is that I'm always thinking about, am I educating towards underlying core values? Meaning I try to keep the core value at the center. Now, a core value could be related to a specific area of our religious life. It could be like tefillah could be a core value, or tzniut, or Shabbat, or chesed, or our connection to Israel. Or a core value could be something more general and sweeping, like the value of being committed to halacha or the value of treating people with respect. But when I'm educating towards a value, and the value is like what's at the center, it enables me to give a lot more room in terms of the expression of that value. Meaning, what's important to me is to give over the value, but the expression or how that value comes to expression could look different for different people. And also, even within one person, it could look different at different stages and times in life. Okay, so let's say if I'm teaching sniyud, and it's very important for me that the value is that they're like committed to halacha, but like there's a lot of different poskim, there's a lot of different rulings on these matters, and like not everybody in terms of what it means for them to be modest. Like I want them to be modest, that's a value, and I want them to be committed to halacha, but which actual psak or approach they follow is less important to me because there's a lot of different young women there sitting there from a lot of different families and a lot of different communities. Or if I'm talking about the value of being
But
connected
does
to
sorry
Israel.
to interrupt you, but does the value come from your perception of what the priority is within this area, or does it come from like the midrash's hashkafa or ethos, or does it come from the young woman herself?
I
Like,
would
how do
say,
you
I would
land on that
say
value to guide you?
Yeah, I would say a mix of all three, meaning like Migdalot certainly has certain values that it stands for. And when a student comes there, she knows that. We're very open about that. But then, of course, they're going to be reflected through who I am and what I, personally believe in and who I think the students are that are sitting in front of me. So let's say I'm talking about the value of a connection to Israel. If I'm talking to a group of overseas students, so that might mean for some of them making Aliyah and moving to Israel, but I'm also going to talk about a lot of other ways in which you could express the value of being connected to Israel. As you know, living in London, you could feel very connected and you could have a strong value of Medinat Yisrael in your life, and it doesn't only have to be expressed through living here. And also for Israeli students, if they're thinking about how to be connected to Israel, for one of them, it may be through chesed, and for another, it may be through, the Torah learning that she's doing right now. And for each person, it's going to be something else. And I'll just tell you, I came right now from Migdalot this morning, and they had a day where a lot of our students who are currently in the army came back to visit and to sit in on different shiurim or whatever. And a few of them stopped me in the hall, and they were talking about the army and the struggles in the army. And one of them said that she has no time to learn, in the army, especially in basic training, the way that she did when she was in Migdalot. And we spoke, mamash al regalacha, like in the hallway, for a few minutes about how her value of Torah and connection to Torah is just as strong as it always was, but the way that it's going to be reflected right now in her life isn't going to be the same thing. But I feel like that's very helpful for people to remember that just because you're expressing it differently than maybe you did a few years ago, right? Or as young mothers, or as people who are very busy in their career, that doesn't mean that you're not connected to that value, or just because you are expressing it differently than your neighbor or your friend or your sibling. So I try to give a lot of room in that area.
Mm-hmm.
One-on-one, many students will come to talk about what does that mean? How could they apply the core values in their life in a way that they feel
Right.
good about? And I think that really leads to the second thing that's on my mind always, which is how to educate in a way that emphasizes and encourages the need for students to take responsibility for their own decisions. Meaning that when they're making a decision that's connected to religious growth or that's connected to religious observance, are they ready to really own it and stand behind it? Have they thought through the different factors, how this is going to affect them, how this is going to affect their families, how they'll navigate? So obviously, on the one hand, I would like all of our students to be as halachic as possible and as committed as possible. But I also want them to make smart choices about how to grow in their observance and how to think about their connection to Hashem so that that growth is long lasting and it's integrated into their life in real and deep ways to where they came from and to where they're headed. And honestly, I'd rather a student grow at a slower pace,
Mm.
but that the growth be rooted and organic and something that she or he is really ready to embrace in an authentic way than to make some drastic immediate change, that maybe feels really great in the moment and gives you this high in the moment. And maybe a teacher could feel really great that they inspired the student to make this change, but then down the road, those things don't always last. So I try to not think so much about the here and now. It's when you're teaching, let's say, tzniut in a midrashah of girls, and my colleagues will be like, it's not depressing that like you teach all these halachot, and then the very next day everyone looks exactly the same way. And I'm like, no, I'm teaching for the long term. And long term, I see that slowly core values become deeply integrated and people make decisions that they're able to incorporate into their life in ways that last and that
Yeah,
are
I think that
specific for
sounds,
them.
well, it sounds very healthy and very good educational practice. And look, I wonder how widespread that kind of approach is, because it seems so clear and obvious the way that you put it across, but I think it also really connects to your personal style. But for full disclosure, I'm thinking about my own journey, and I think I've spoken before on this podcast. But when I was actually after my year spent in Israel, when I didn't have the opportunity to really get into learning as much as I'd wanted to, I spent a year in Chile, which was part
Wow.
of my degree when I was learning Spanish, and I ended up just totally hashgacha pratit, but totally just so happened I ended up with this amazing community in Chile that were really involved in learning, and I took the time to really deepen my Torah learning at that time, and I was really far from home, right, like practically the other side of the world, and in a way I really found it much easier because I think being a dutiful young person who didn't want to shock or scare her parents about her religious growth and journey, I'd found it quite difficult before when I was really much more part of the family unit. But having that distance and being able to do my own thing, I felt I was able to make my own choices and
Mm-hmm.
have the space to explore. So for me, it was healthy. But I think what you're saying about making sure that people take responsibility for those choices, I think people, when you are far away, parents often worry you've got rebellion or you've got teachers who are influencing. But actually, as long as people are, even if they do have role models, they are exploring those choices in a healthy way and making them for themselves, then
Mm-hmm.
to me, like that's really the
Yeah,
importance in what you just said. That's the shift that I think makes it
absolutely.
healthy and and not overly influencing.
Absolutely. And I think it also helps that I teach in an Israeli Beit Midrash. So even though we have a group of around 25 overseas students that come mostly from America, but also sometimes from London or South Africa or Australia,
Mm-hmm.
they're in the context of Israeli students who every other Shabbat go home. So that
Right.
idea of like that you could kind of put people in a bubble and separate them from their families and
Mm.
no, you have to teach in I think a healthier context where people are naturally going in and out of their home environment, and therefore you have to help them integrate in
Mm-hmm.
I think, a more organic, healthy way.
Right. But also the kind of midrasha that Migdalos is, for those who don't know it, is a very, very high level midrasha that teaches textual skills of Gemara the highest level I think that exists in Israel. And so every choice that a woman is making, presumably she's developing the tools to explore them for herself. So
Yeah,
nothing is just taken as,
right. And it's
this.
an institution, also Yeshivat Har Zion, the Gush, like we believe deeply in autonomy and in independence and in raising individuals who could stand on their own 2 feet and not be dependent.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you about the challenges that young women at that age are facing. You mentioned some of the issues of relationships and nagia and sneer and some of the hot button issues like when am I going to get
Well,
married and who should I be looking for and kolisha and some of the troubling issues that maybe people are exploring. But I'm wondering about the perspective that you have, having been there for 15 years, because some of these things do change over time to do with Gen Z, Gen Alpha, what's on young people's minds who also live in the outside world. What are the issues that women are struggling with today that perhaps they weren't struggling with 5, 10 years ago?
hmm. I find actually that most of the issues are the same,
Oh, really?
in Chadash Tachat Hashemesh, because
Mm-hmm.
most of the real issues that someone comes to talk to me about are the personal issues, which are often over like decisions, over like the little ones, like, should I take more Gemara, or should I learn more Tanakh, or should I do Chesed now, or should I sleep more, or, so there's like the little day-to-day decisions, and then there's the really big consequential decisions like should I make Aliyah or go back to London? Should
Wow.
I do the army or should I do Sheirut Leumi if I'm an Israeli student or someone make Aliyah? What career do I want to pursue? But if I understand what you're asking, like in terms of like faith related questions
Mm-hmm.
or belief questions or things like that, I think I would say two things. One is obviously all the issues that have to do with the way in which people are like treated and respected, in the Western world, which is not exactly like they are getting this right all the time, but just in terms of individual rights, or let's say LGBT, the LGBT community, or
Mm-hmm.
women, and how those issues run up against the way in which sometimes Judaism approaches these things. Those I think are big issues for
Mm-hmm.
young people today, because anywhere where there's going to be a clash between the Western liberal values that they've been raised on and also Jewish values, so they're going to want to understand that more. I think also there's a lot of questions just about the development of halakha. I don't see so many questions, not nearly as much as I used to, about doubting God, like if there's a God or believing in God. I see many more questions about the halachic process and how it developed and how did the rabbis come to this conclusion and why do we trust them? A lot more like
Mm-hmm.
suspicion about, and I think that has to do with the world that we live in and like less respect for authority, and a lot more autonomy and individualism. So I see questions like that and also a lot of search for meaning. People are just
Mm-hmm.
looking for meaning in a world that often feels empty. And I think social media and the impact that that has had on young people's lives and relationships and what's real and what's fake, definitely also questions just surrounding those kinds of issues of how do people make choices that they feel like make them feel good in their lives
Mm-hmm.
in deep ways, not in the, just happy-go-lucky kind of way.
So interesting also the point about having less trust in rabbinic authority and how they made those decisions, because I wonder if that's less trust in rabbis and in a way because they're men or might not be able to relate to
Yeah.
their personal journeys, and that could be massively helped by being able to come to somebody like you.
That
Or if
certainly comes
it's
up.
just it's the halachic process itself and not seeing women's voices reflected in the halachic conversation that they're learning in the Sforim.
Yeah, both of those. Like how is this rabbi commenting on me and he doesn't even understand and he doesn't know it from the inside. And also, yeah, where are women's voices in this whole conversation? And there I really always try to broaden the perspective. And this comes
Mm-hmm.
up a lot in the podcast with Yosefa because we're talking there about mitzvot. But I always try to broaden the perspective that this is true. Unfortunately, in every area in our lives, someone who's studying medicine or law, they're also not going to come against a lot of literature that was written by women because that's the world. But I try to more push them in the direction of, but Isa Yofi, how amazing is it that today, thank God, women are writing and speaking and developing and researching and part of the conversation, whether it's the halacha conversation or whether it's the world of medicine or any worlds of professionalism that we have today. Thank God women's voices
Mm-hmm.
are part of that, but it's not a unique challenge that we only face in the Jewish world.
Yeah, I agree to a point, although I worked as a lawyer for many years before I moved into the Torah world, and I would say that it's much more acute in the Torah world within Orthodoxy and learning. But
Yes,
to
the
me, I
gaps
just
are,
take it on as a challenge, and I think the world of women who are starting to write Sforim and to get involved in writing Shuvot and writing generally is like historic and
yeah,
so exciting.
you're right.
So
The
let's talk
gaps are
about women
bigger.
writing. So let's talk about women writing and your book, because I think it's a fascinating book and an important book, and I hope that people know about it. And I want to ask you about it because what you're doing in that book is really exploring the concept of decisions. And you've said that people come to you with decisions. Should I make aliyah? Like these are big life decisions.
Hmm.
And I've never really seen a very clear framework as to how one should make those decisions. And so, in a way, what you're doing is trying to coach people from a kind of a spiritual perspective, but trying to coach people through how to make those decisions. And you talk about some really, really important um, values and ideas when it comes to trusting yourself and having that self awareness in order to trust yourself and not be led by external pressures that we so often are led by, not be led by fear, and how to work in this kind of framework where outcomes actually are uncertain, but really relating to decision making as a skill. And I think it's a
Hmm.
very beautiful way of looking at it. And I'm wondering about, a lot of these messages are quite universal and I think apply to all of us at any stage in life, actually. And I would encourage everybody to read it. But I wonder how Jewish it is and where you come from a Torah perspective, but where is God in that? And what is unique, I suppose, within our Jewish world that affected the way that you set out that framework?
You're absolutely right that the underlying principles that I explore and develop in the book, which by the way, it was just such an interesting process writing the book, because a lot of things that I kind of felt intuitively when I would speak to a student, but then I had to break it down and like try to think how to make it into categories, which was an interesting process in of itself. But you're right that the underlying principles in the book are basically principles that I think are universal, meaning they're about making good decisions and standing behind them and making sure that your decisions are consistent with your values. The book is called What Do You Really Want? Because not what do you want in an impulsive way, but like what do you really want in a deep way? What is like reflective on the most truest level of who you are? And actually, when I started writing the book, I did think for a little bit, like, should I try to put something out there that's not Jewish, that's just,
Mm-hmm.
there's all these great books. We were just talking about the book Let Them, which I don't know if that made that to
Yeah, yeah.
English. But like, it's like all over in every store. And like my husband's like, you could have written that. It's like, and I'm like, I don't know if I could have written something that would have been like, popular in that way. But the reason that I
Let Them,
decided,
for those who don't know, it's I think it's like a number one bestseller, but it's Mel Robbins, who's this big
yes.
American podcaster, influencer, very American, but very universal. And she talks about this let them theory, which is essentially just like doesn't matter what other people think. That's
Yeah,
basically
just
summing it
let
up,
it
right?
go, kind of like let go of all your angst. So I do think the book could be, applied to anyone of any religion, any background, but specifically because it's on a topic that is so relevant to day-to-day life, like who doesn't struggle with decision making. When I started writing, I realized that I wanted the book to be a book that had a lot of real and true to life examples. And when I started thinking about how I wanted to write those examples, I realized that I wanted them to resonate strongly with members of the community that I'm from. I wanted them to open up the book and see themselves in those examples and be like, wow, like how does she know the things that like I grapple with? Not because I tell anyone what decision to make there, but because when you relate to something that feels like it's your life, the same way people like sometimes watching these television shows that come out of Israel, because all of a sudden you see Orthodox Jews on a screen and different thing, a Shabbos lamp, and you're like, oh, that's something that's uniquely Jewish when you see that on a screen. So that was very, very important to me. So much so that when the book was translated 4 years after it came out to Hebrew, before it was translated to Hebrew, I adapted a lot of the stories to be like Israeli versions of the same story. Or I even changed the name. Like I always say in the English book, there's no one named Shaked or Geffen, like these Israeli names that no one would relate to in the Anglo world. But it's very important for me that the book is very, very relatable. And one of the reasons that it's especially important to me that I wanted to write to Orthodox Jews is because a little bit what we were saying before, the concept of authority and respect and rabbanim and is very big in our community. Thank God, like our relationship to Hashem, our relationship to our parents, to our rabbis, to our teachers. And yet, I believe that it's so important that we raise children and that we educate students to feel comfortable becoming adults who are not dependent on others when it comes to their big life decisions. And I think this is true,
Mm,
by the way, even in a more yeshivish or more Haredi world where there's like this concept of dot Torah and asking, rabbis everything, even they have to decide what they ask the rabbi and what not, and what they take
mhm.
responsibility for. And I just wanted to empower our community members to feel like they can make good decisions from a place of trust and not fear. So, in that sense, the book is Jewish because the examples and the framework is Jewish, but I think what you're really asking is something deeper, which is there like a uniquely Jewish message here? And my answer is absolutely, because God created us with the Chira Chofshit. He created
Mm.
us with the freedom to choose and the freedom to make our own decisions. He didn't want us to be like angels who just have to do the mission that they were given. And this did not have to be the case. And I always think about, if Hashem created us like this, it must mean that He really, really believes in us as humans. And He really believes in our capability to make good choices. So for me, a big part of believing in Hashem is believing in His belief in us. And that means that we have to believe in ourselves that we can make good decisions in life. So I feel like what's more Jewish than that? It has to do with our belief
That's
in Hashem.
yeah, look, that's so fascinating. And what you just said though about Das Torah and asking rabbis questions, I hadn't thought about it like that. And in a way, there's a kind of a subversiveness about it, about giving people the confidence to not need to ask things that they don't need to ask, and knowing what
Yeah.
you do need to ask and what's halachic and what's personal. But you're saying this is somebody who does get a lot of questions. So in a way, what you're doing is helping people to come to you with less questions or stand on their own 2 feet or know how to develop those skills that you're giving over to them, to teach them to be able to do it themselves.
Totally. First of all, when I teach halacha, I always try to empower people with knowledge. Knowledge is power. So I don't just tell them the bottom line. I tell them how we got there, and I'll tell them, and if this
Mm-hmm.
situation comes up and this, so that they'll know, like, that they won't have to ask anytime something happens because they've already been given the framework. And also beyond that, when people come to me with like personal life decisions and I feel like they're trying to get me to tell them what to do, I always say, you don't really think that I'm going to tell you if you should break up with that guy, or if you should make aliyah or whatever. Like, I don't want that responsibility, but not because I'm afraid to take responsibility, because you have to own this. This is really
Yeah.
big and you have to stand behind it. So, yeah, absolutely. You're tapping into things that are very core to what I believe in.
I wonder if you could give us an example. I'm just thinking now, if I was to kind of role play with you and say, and this is real, by the way, that I really feel very deeply that I want to live in Israel, but I've never found that it can be the right time, and there's so many complicated issues, and children, and family, and school, and like, what do I do? Help me. What would you say to someone to help them through that process?
So a huge part of the book, that's why it's called Trust and Fear in Everyday Decisions, is about figuring out what's motivating you. And I always feel like if you're able to get to the heart, and it's not easy at all to figure out, are you motivated by fear? There's all kinds of fears, what does this say about me? Or what will people think about me? Or am I missing out? If I'm missing out on the opportunity of a lifetime to raise my kids in Israel, or, that there's also fears on the other side. Like, what if I don't find a job there that I want? Or what if I'm not able to contribute in the way that I want? Or what if we can't make it financially? Or what's coming from fear and what's coming from trust? Trust is, I call that deep feeling of like, I really want this, and I trust that I know that I really want this, and therefore, if I want this, I'll be able to grapple with the things that are kind of scaring me and standing in the way. So when I'm talking to someone about Israel, it's like exactly going through that. Like if someone sits down and she's like, I always wanted to make aliyah. And she's like, but I want to talk about it with you. So as I start listening and I'm like, okay, so tell me, like, what's on your mind? Why do you want to make aliyah? And she says things, oh, well, the summer after 10th grade, when I came to Israel, I told everyone on my bus that I'm making
Mm.
aliyah right after. No, I don't hear in that. I hear her saying she's afraid to, like disappoint her 10th grade self. Or if she says, well, I have to make aliyah because like, isn't that what Jews are supposed to do? I don't hear in that want. I hear in that this feeling of
Mm.
guilt. Or if she says, I have to make aliyah because if I go back to America, I'm going to get stuck there. Like, you're trying to listen very, very carefully. But when I hear someone
Hmm.
say, I don't know, I just really want to be here and I know I'm going to miss my family, or I know that, I may not be able to contribute in the way that I used to contribute when I was in London or whatever it is. So then you're hearing them like, wow, it sounds like you really want this. Like, are you ready to own all the hard parts of what
Hmm.
this is? Do you want this enough? And then it's
Hmm.
also looking with them at all the prices of that decision and making sure they're really ready to stand behind them. Uh,
Mm. Wow. So
and it's
you're
not a
really
simple thing.
reflecting back to really listening and reflecting back, which is kind of style of coaching,
Yeah.
but in a very deep way.
Yeah.
And
Not
I
reflecting
think,
back by parroting their words, but like trying to
mm,
really actually hear what it is that they're saying and help
right,
them hear themselves.
right. And I'm thinking now that it is quite different at age 18, 19, 20 to at age, grand old ages of having lots of children and other things going on in your life. Because in a way, it's complex when they're young because you don't want to overly influence and they have to learn to take responsibility for their own decisions. But in a way, there is a simplicity to making a decision as a single person that is less
Right.
encumbered by so many other factors.
Yeah. That doesn't always mean though that it's the right thing. Sometimes they say that, isn't it easier to come now? And it's like only if you actually really want to come now. If you come
Right,
now alone, but you don't want to be here, it's not going to
right,
end up playing out well for you.
right, right, right.
So,
Gosh, so everyone should read the book to see more examples to work through them. But I want to ask you about one of the other things you do, which is writing. Because I've read a number of your blog posts on Times of Israel, and I'm really always struck by how beautiful and emotionally sensitive they are. I don't know how you choose the topics that you write about, but they really tap into this kind of sophisticated perspective of living in Israel and how you respond to that and the responsibility and the burden, but the privilege of living in Israel and the way that the war has impacted you on a kind of emotional, psychological level. And it was making me think about this putting things into words in terms of writing for a wider audience versus teaching and why is it that you choose to write, like what's important to you about doing that, what are you trying to get across?
when you said now, like, how do you choose your topics? I was thinking, I don't actually really choose my topics because
I
I
choose to.
write, I write primarily for myself. What I mean by that is I write when I feel this inner feeling that really started like there was a
Mm,
really hard year here, 2015 to 16, where in Gush Etzion there were a lot of piguim and a neighbor of ours was killed. And it's like I was walking around all the time with this intense jumble of emotion. And sometimes I would sit down and I would write something. And through the process of writing, which was completely spontaneous, I would make sense of what I'm feeling inside, which when I sat down, I wasn't even sure of what I was feeling. And that is basically what has continued to be the motivator of when I write. Even last night, I got into bed and my husband's like, "What's on your minds?" Because he saw something. And I'm like, actually,
mm,
like the last 2 days, I'm feeling that feeling of like something's going on in me. And I knew what had triggered it. It was a specific exchange with someone. And I haven't had a minute to sit down and try to
mm,
write and to process it out. He's like, "I feel a blog coming." And I'm like, if I have time. But like, that's where it comes from. And what I found is that when you write from that very authentic place, like for
mm,
myself to understand it, and I'm able to find the words, which sometimes take me time, but sometimes they just come like pouring out.
mm,
Usually, I'm not alone in that feeling. Like usually if I'm feeling something strongly, it's because what's going on here in this country right now. And then when other people tell me, wow, like I read what you wrote and it resonated so deeply, and it even helped me put into words what I was going through, that's so meaningful to me because
mm,
it just happened in like a very natural way. And basically, the way that I started blogging is I was writing things like this to the Bogrot, the alumni of Migdaluz, and to my family when I would have like this kind of experience. And then one time, an older, friend of mine who I knew from back in America, Anne Gordon, somehow one of the pieces made their way to her, and she is one of the editors of the op-ed blog section of the Times of
a
Israel.
very
She said,
talented
"Shayna, you have to
editor. She's
start a
brilliant.
blog." And I said, "No, that's not me. I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Instagram. I'm not on, I don't know, like I'm not on those public platforms in those way." And she's like, "No, but it could be meaningful. Like it could be meaningful for people in Israel. It could be meaningful for Jews outside of Israel because it helps them feel very connected to what's going on." And basically, she convinced me, and I'm very, very grateful to her because it's been a really special and meaningful outlet for me. And I know that it's something that has helped people connect either to themselves or to Israel. And I try also, like when I'm writing, because that's just who I am and the prism through which I see the world, to like also incorporate Torah ideas like into these things, because for me, it's natural. So sometimes it ties into the Parsha, or sometimes it ties into an upcoming Chag, or sometimes it just ties into a Jewish Torah concept or value. And yeah, I've been very grateful for that
That's something, I think
experience.
there's something very emotional about the way you write that really represents your leadership and represents the way that you're so effective. Because I think a lot of people, and sometimes myself included, I do like to write, but I find that when you start with a piece of Torah that you want to teach, or like a pasuk in the parsha that is leading your Devar Torah for that week, and then you try and tap into, well, how does that connect to how I'm feeling, or how does that connect to what's going on in the world right now? Sometimes it can come across quite contrived. And I'm saying this because I literally, like, the next thing I need to do is to go and write a parsha about Torah for a newspaper because I've got a commitment to do it. But, you know, it's so much more effective if you're writing when you feel something and when you have something that you want to say. And I know this just from also the book that I'm trying to work on, which is relating to my work in Get Refusal, but it really does come pouring out onto the page when there's something you feel really deeply and something that you want to say. It's a totally different kind of experience.
Yes. And sometimes when I'm asked to write, I don't always, say yes, because I mean, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it's important to do something that requires research and it's a different kind of writing. But right now, at this point in my life, the writing that is just most meaningful for me is exactly what you described, like that writing that comes from a more spontaneous place. And if I had to write, a drasha every week like my father used to, or if I had to write a column, every week for a magazine, like I think it's just a very, very different process that's also very, very, very significant. But right now, just in the balance of things in my life and the intensity of everything going on in Israel, it's not where I could put my energies. So I
Mm-hmm.
write in a not consistent way. Like sometimes I could write like two pieces in a week, and sometimes a few months could pass, just depending on what I'm going through.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I'd like to finish with one question, which is something that I always try and think through with my guest, which is about leadership, women's leadership in the Orthodox world, and really looking ahead, say to 20 years. And you're already doing so many things. And you mentioned, for example, your parents and your rabbi role model in your father, and how you wanted to do some of those things. But in a way, you're doing so many aspects of a rabbi's role right now. But I'm thinking about what might the experience of Orthodox women look like in 20 years as far as leadership and being an educator, being a role model? Like, will it be the same as now, or are there more things that you hope will transpire over the next coming decades?
You have such great questions. Thank you. Like, really, just so thought-provoking. The first thing that I think about when you say that is that I just feel very blessed and very lucky to be living in this very special time where, Baruch Hashem, I look around and there are a lot of incredible female leaders and role models in all segments of our community, by the way. Like, even when you look to the more yeshivish or more Haredi communities, you'll find that many Beis Yaakovs have female principals, which was not always true. And you'll find big Torah teachers, women with huge followings who give shurim or have podcasts or run popular parenting seminars and things like that. But when I think about where I'd like our community to be in the next 20 years, what I'd like to see more of, and I think thankfully is already happening, is that female leaders are not only thought of as models for other women, but that there's a realization that women can contribute to the community as a whole, and that the men of our community also stand to benefit from that. I think it's so wonderful and meaningful and has a real impact on men, especially young men, when they're able to learn Torah from women, because they bring a little bit of a different perspective or their ideas or their insight, even the tone that they teach in. And I grew up in an all girls family, but now I have four boys and a daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And my four boys in the high school that they were here in Israel, they did not have a single female teacher, not even for
Wow.
secular studies. And it made me sad. Like, I want them and their friends, and like, thank God they get that in our home and in their aunts and in their grandmothers and in our neighbors and all the amazing women that they're exposed to in Alon Shvut. But like, I want them and the men of their generation to learn from and hear from intelligent women, because I think it impacts their worldview, and I think it helps create more respect, and I think it also creates dialogue that's important for all of us, because the dialogue that happens when women are part of the conversation is different than the dialogue that happens when it's only men, or by the way, when it's only women. I like that, like that crossover and the crossbreeding of ideas. And if we want our Torah world to be dynamic, and we want it to be relevant, and we want it to be very engaged with the world that we live in, then I think it's very important. We live in a mixed world, and it's very important that women's voices be heard. And just as a small example, I'll say in this podcast with Yosef, ever since we started the Women Talking Mitzvot podcast, we've heard from several men, some of whom are like teachers in female institutions, or are rabbis of communities or of shuls, who have said that even though like they are in contact and they do teach women, hearing two women teachers talk about these topics and talk about these mitzvot have made them think about aspects of the halachot that they never really thought about before, or they just weren't sensitized to those things because they didn't hit up against them in the same way as men. Like just today, Yosef and I recorded about Kiddush, and we were talking about the fact that women are completely and fully obligated in Kiddush, and that's something that people don't always realize, because the Shabbos Abba usually makes Kiddush in the Gan, and that affects us. And also what that means, let's say if you have a divorced woman or a single woman who is alone in her home with her kids, and she always makes Kiddush, and now she has guests over and men, like does she have to ask one of the men to say Kiddush, or could she say? That's not necessarily a question that rabbis are always thinking about, because it's also not necessarily a question that a woman may come asking him about, or whatever. It's just dependent on different levels of sensitivity. So I really hope, going back to how we started, like the integrity and the sensitivity and the fact that I really, really believe that we could hold both of them. So part of having the sensitivity that we need to for our community moving forward, and also having integrity towards the halacha, I think means making sure that women's leadership is something that continues to be developed, not only for other women, not only as role models to young girls, but for our community as a whole.
Amen. That's so beautifully put. And I believe in that so deeply on so many levels, like really from, I guess, from one extreme, from my experience sitting in the Bet Din and working in a way that really changed very often the perceptions of cases. And I really see, as I say often on this podcast, the importance of women being involved in the conversation at all levels. But as you say, that extends to our sons, and the way that that's normalized across all spaces. So yeah, thank you for ending with that. That's such a critical point, and such a healthy one in the way that you describe it, that relates back to the way that you lead and the way that you support the girls that you work with, and really like kol hakavod, because I think what you do is fantastic. And I'm so grateful that you explained it so well. So thank you. And let me thank all of our listeners for joining. Please get in touch or send feedback, and rate and share and follow the podcast, and send your suggestions. And if you're looking for some Jewish learning to start in January, we have many brilliant year courses and termly courses at LSJS. So please do check them out at lsjs.ac.uk. We've got one this year on the Rambam, one on Rabbi Sax's influence, one on Torah, 3 different personalities. So do join if you're looking for learning, and follow me and join me next time. Thank you so much, Rabbanit Shayna Goldberg.
Thank you.